And we are live, and I sound weird in my own ears because I'm wearing different headphones, and you'll see that in like 2 seconds based on the way that the screen's fading out. I look like a dummy, but it doesn't matter. The NBA Finals are here. Game 1, Lakers Heat. It is Wednesday, September 30th. The entire world didn't end after the debate last night. I'm just here with Greg Ehrenberg to break down Finals Game 1. So, Greg, how are you?
Good. I mean, better than you with your AirPods situation. But no, I love the cans. I think you're looking sharp with a very, very radio-esque, very professional looking.
I look dumb. They're huge. They're so huge. They're fantastic to be on an airplane and have no one bother you. They're not as great for simply trying to do this. I sound very tinny in my own ears. It's annoying. I don't know what to do about it, but I don't think there's anything that I can do about it. What we can do about it is simply just talk about the NBA. But first, as you get in the door, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you know when this and all of our other content goes live. We've got a ton of it today. I will touch on some of it in a little bit. We're going to start here, right out of the gate. Who wins this series?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we have to consider it the Lakers. Lakers are the biggest favorite, second biggest favorite in the last 12 years in terms of how they're priced in the series. I don't know what to make of it, though, because the Heat really steamrolled through everybody on the way to the finals. So I kind of have mixed feelings, which are the Heat just kind of a sneaky, great team that we were just totally unaware of entering the season? Or did the East just really suck this year and did the Heat play in a bunch of matchups that were really favorable for them? And I don't really know. I don't have a good read on it. A few people have asked me, like, hey, who do you think should be favored in this series? Do you think the line's too line? How do you handicap it? And the honest thing is I have no clue. I think I'm going to have a better feel after game 1 because I could see it going one of two ways. I could see the Heat just continue to play really well, and they're just a team that we've underrated all year. But I could see it going the other way, too, where just the Lakers have way more talent on their roster, especially on the high end with Anthony Davis and LeBron, and they just steamroll the Heat. And then we just look back in hindsight and go, boy, the East really sucked this year, and we just weren't aware of it until after the season ended.
I think the East is good. I think the Milwaukee thing is largely an aberration, but that nobody's going to want to take that. And I think like the Heat, the Celtics, the Raptors, even the Sixers to a lesser extent are all sort of the same, just depending on who plays who. I think it could look a little bit different. I mean, the Raptors could have obviously easily beaten the Celtics. Series against the Heat could look entirely different. The series of the Celtics and the Heat could have clearly gone in more than one direction. I think it's just a lot of really solid teams. The fact that the Heat came out of it, I don't think says a ton. I think they're just good.
Yeah, that could be the case. I'm not totally sure that is what it is. I think they could just be a decent team, and there was just a lot of decent teams in the Eastern Conference, and there wasn't really one elite team. I mean, who knows how the Bucks series plays out? If Bledsoe was hurt at the start of the series, and as soon as he gets healthy, Giannis gets hurt. And then also the Bucks were just kind of off in the playoffs, which we've seen from them in the past too. And then Budenholzer, if he's willing to play starters 35, 36 minutes, who knows how that plays out. So there's a lot of other factors there. But yeah, my takeaway is going to be if the Lakers just destroy the Heat in the finals as the line suggests for the series that it's going to be, then I'm going to look back on this feeling this was a really weak year for the Eastern Conference. Yeah,
I think the Bucks just make it weird because they were clearly the best regular season team. There's no real debate for that piece of information. I think we're just going to end up seeing that the East is just like a lot of the Rockets and the Nuggets, and neither. In this case, it doesn't make the Clippers look very good, but I think the Clippers and the Lakers were the two best teams in the West. I think we're just going to see that they were 1 and 2, and that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, basically for all of the East is pretty comparable. So I agree that they're a step below for the West. I don't know. It's the Heat are a great team, and it seems like that is carrying them a little bit, and I think that helps.
If the Heat were to win this series, they would be the second biggest underdogs to win the finals in NBA history. The biggest is the Pistons beating the Heat in 2004. I mean, the Pistons beating the Lakers in 2004.
Yeah. God, I can still picture where I was when that happened, which is so crazy. Just real, not sober in Ocean City, Maryland.
Hey, that's the way to celebrate. Chauncey Billups and Rip Hamilton.
I was in a dumpster of a hotel, just totally wrecked. Being like, well, the Pistons won? I can picture it clear as day. About to take a shot of Aftershock, which is just ultra terrible liquor. Anyway, nobody cares. Let's talk about this game. Again, hit that like button as you come in the door. This is game one. So we actually have to talk about this a little bit. Not that we didn't have to talk about all of the other games that we've had, but new stuff is about to happen. I think we should start on the Heat side first, if that works for you. I don't think that there's too much to look into from a Bam and Jimmy Butler perspective. If the Heat have any chance of this series going well for them, like those two guys are just going to have to keep playing at very, very high levels. As of right now, Bam, 42% owned in the utility spot, 9% owned in the captain. Butler, 17% owned in the captain spot on DraftKings, 48% in the utility. The guy that I think that we need to talk about would be Goran Dragic. And he is at technically 0.9% ownership in the captain spot and only 15% ownership in the utility spot. He is the fifth most expensive guy. What do we do here? Is this a bad series for him? His style of game, I don't necessarily think fits against the Lakers, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so I mean, we see Dragic score so many, especially in the playoffs. He scored so many of his points in the paint, and there's not really an in-between for him, right? He's either knocking down threes or he's making shots around the basket. I can't see him doing that against Dwight Howard and the Anthony Davis combination. And also, we look at the price of Goran Dragic. This is really expensive for him. I mean, remember, we opened the postseason, he was priced at $4,400. So his price is almost double what it was then. And obviously, it's a little different now because we've gone from the regular format to the showdown type format. So the pricing is different. But even so, there's been a massive increase in Dragic over the course of the postseason. And now he's at a point where I think he's a little bit too expensive. To your point about the ownership, though, if the ownership is going to stay this low, that makes him, a viable option. But I really don't like the price tag on him that much.
He has 15% ownership on FanDuel in a spot where Tyler Hero is $500 more expensive than him, and he is $3,000 cheaper than Bam. I assume these numbers change. When I ran my sim earlier today for FanDuel, I got Dragic in 48% of my lineups, and we have him projected for 15. If that holds, I'm going to end up having him in 100% of my lineups on FanDuel.
That's a lot. That's a high percentage.
It is. I mean, I'm projecting him to be in the optimal lineup 3 times as often as the public. Like there's no way around that one for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valid point. I would say I hadn't really looked at the ownership or FanDuel versus DraftKings yet, but he would make more sense on FanDuel than DraftKings. The other thing too is it's hard for me to imagine that either LeBron or AD, probably even both of them, aren't in the optimal lineup, and that's just going to set up a lot of stars and scrubs type builds. So I see how that's how the ownership shakes out.
98% ownership to AD right now on FanDuel, 85 to LeBron. In my sim, I had them basically in 80%. That's probably ends up being a little low, other than factoring in just injuries that would remove those guys. It's basically impossible for those guys to not be 2 of the top 4 scorers on a given day. I just can't stop looking at Dragic because, like, we've got Rondo, $500 behind him. I have Dragic 11 fantasy points ahead of him. Crowder is $1,000 cheaper. I've got him 8 points clear. I just, like, to me, he should be in an upper tier. It's crazy to me that Hero is more expensive than him. Hero, $600 cheaper on DraftKings. Both guys not picking up much ownership, nor is Duncan Robinson, $6,800 on DK, just 6% ownership. So we've got this tier of LeBron, AD, Bam, Butler. And then the next tier is just complete ghost town from ownership on DK. Let's move it to this. Who is the guy from the Heat you like the most today?
I'll ask you this: from ownership perspective, points per dollar, value, like which tier?
In general, well, if you've got more than one, if you've got like this is the guy I like at the top, this is the guy I like at the bottom, go for it.
Yeah, it's tough.
No rules on this show.
Okay, yeah, no rules. That's fair enough. This isn't something strict like the 100 yards and a touchdown. This is free flowing.
That was close.
You're not gonna like my answer, but it's probably Andre Iguodala.
I don't hate it.
Okay, because I mean we've talked about Iguodala in the past, and points per dollar he's absolutely crap this year, right? He doesn't do very much. Maybe it's a little bit of bias on my part too, because I was very high on him last game, and he ended up making me a good amount of money in Showdown. So I kind of want to go back to the well, but it's a lot of the same reasons I liked him last game that I like him this game. And it's because why did the Heat bring in Andre Iguodala to this team? And it was for a playoff push. Now, I'm sure there's no way they envisioned they were going to make the finals at that point in time. But still, they brought him in thinking, hey, we want to have his presence, we want to have his defense on the court in big playoff games. And if we look at his playing time over the last couple of games, I mean, he's playing a ton. And especially just because of his reputation of being a guy who could guard LeBron, whether that's true or not isn't even really relevant, because I do think the Heat buy into it enough to where they're going to want to play Iguodala big minutes against LeBron. We look at him in the last few games, 28 minutes, 20 minutes, 27 minutes. So even though he isn't a good per minute fantasy producer, it's kind of tough to find really cheap value in this contest. And if Iguodala is going to play, 26, 28 minutes, which I expect for him guarding LeBron, as bad of a fantasy producer as he is at his price point, he's probably going to be of decent value just because there's enough minutes for him.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with it. I mean, this is the series that the Heat have him for. Like I would be shocked if he played his way out of the rotation in the series. I would just think for that to happen, like Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson would need, and Jay Crowder to a lesser extent, would need to just simply be shooting the lights out. So this is what Iguodala is there for. I think his minutes are pretty secure at the 24 to potentially significantly more range. I mean, he was playing backup 5 basically in the last game for the Heat. The piece that trips me up a little bit, and it's not that I don't like him, he's at 39% ownership right now. Who do you have projected for more fantasy points? Andre Iguodala or Kyle Kuzma, $400 more expensive?
Iguodala, because of the playing time difference. So the issue with Kuzma is there's just not very many minutes for him in the playoffs, and his usage is so low, and he sucked. There's a couple of times that I've gone to Kuzma and I've written him up in my building blocks article, which is free on Awesemo.com, and I've I've said like, hey, Kuzma's projected for no ownership today, and he's somebody who I always perceive as having some upside, because I always think there's a chance like, hey, Kuzma, decent per minute fantasy producer. If he gets on the court for extended minutes, there's always a chance he has a big game, and nobody ever rosters him. But he's just so bad. And I was making this joke the other day when I was talking with Wafi is everything you feel about when Steph Curry takes an open 3 in the corner where you already know it's in and he's running the opposite way. You could say the same thing about Kyle Kuzma where you know it's going to miss. Like, he could take that shot and he should also turn around and run the opposite way because there's no doubt what the outcome is. He's missed so many open shots in the postseason. I don't think he's even taken a contested shot. But it doesn't matter. He misses every single open shot he gets, whether it's the top of the key, the corner. He had that wide open 3 in the game against the Nuggets at the top of the key. Almost didn't even hit the net. He airballed. It was one of the worst airballs I've ever seen in an NBA game. And that's kind of what I get hung up on with Kuzma is I don't know if this is a mental thing because as much as he isn't good, he's not this bad. And then you just look at his production in the playoffs, like he's struggling to crack 15 fantasy points. So it's just, I just don't know how playable he is for the Lakers. And then when he is on the court, he's not producing very much. That over the course of the playoffs, you could have played 0% Kyle Kuzma and you would have been ahead in that situation.
I'm just going to pay close attention to the ownership between Iguodala and Kuzma because of how close they are in price. Because I do think that with this being a different series, we could potentially see a little bit more Kuzma. I don't know. At this point, we're guessing. And I guess we should probably just transition to it right now in a way. Actually, we probably got to hit on a little bit more Heat before we get to what the Lakers are going to do at the 5. Do you think that we see Kelly Olynyk? Do you think we see Kendrick Nunn? Do you think we see Derek Jones? Do you think we see insert random guy Myers Leonard being rumored to potentially see the rotation? Well, maybe not the rotation, but to see the floor again. What kind of changes are you expecting out of Spo for Game 1?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I assume that we're going to see Kelly Olynyk back in the rotation, but I don't think it's going to be enough minutes to where I want to play him. If we see the last 3 games from the Heat, he played 0 minutes, 4 minutes, and then 0 minutes. Yeah. So I think that we could see 8 minutes or so of Kelly Olynyk. The reason I'm just I'm probably not going to play him is because I think there's better value plays, and I'm so unsure of what his minutes are going to be that it really makes it tough to invest in him.
I don't think that they can play him with LeBron on the floor. LeBron is not the type of guy that's going to waste potential matchups. If Kelly Olynyk is on the floor, Kelly Olynyk is going to be in a pick and roll every single possession until they have to play Kelly Olynyk off the floor. So I'm a little nervous about Olynyk's minutes. We've got Solomon Hill at 11% ownership right now. I assume he can continue to see like a rotation as a wing defender. I don't really see a scenario where I want to be rostering Solomon Hill. I don't necessarily know that Kendrick Nunn is the guy that I'm looking for here. I think they kind of like Derek Jones is probably a guy that I think could be first up, just given his athletic ability and skill set. I think it's going to look a lot like the late parts of the Celtics series where they really just tighten this rotation and don't, unless it starts to go wildly wrong and they need to make changes because what they're doing isn't working. I don't think they're making a lot of changes off of the end of the Celtics series.
Yeah, I think the biggest risk here for the rotation is if Bam gets in foul trouble trying to go. Because, I mean, we saw Dwight Howard get Jokic into foul trouble. We've seen LeBron get a ton of guys into foul trouble. That's where I think is the most likely situation that really just throws the heat the heat off is early foul trouble for Bam. And then I mean, all bets are off. So maybe now I could talk myself into a little Olynyk. And I've said this before that if you want to play a small amount of lineups with Olynyk, I think that's sensible. But just set a rule in Fantasy Cruncher where it's don't put Kelly Olynyk in the same lineups as Bam Adebayo, because that's a situation where I think Olynyk becomes viable as Bam gets into foul trouble.
I think that Myers Leonard is viable if Bam gets into foul trouble.
I think the other issue is, let me see when he's actually gotten into the. I can't remember him having a fantasy relevant game in forever.
He hasn't played.
But even when he got on the court, I think there was a couple playoff games where he got on and just looked terrible. I remember him.
He's 1,500. Wait, that's not the right contest.
It could be 1,500 in the captain spot.
He's 1,500 in the captain spot.
Yeah. Let's see. When's the last time he got on the court? It's
not going to be fun. That much I can tell you. And I'm not saying that this is like a high likelihood outcome, but I think they might have to go to him over Olynyk because they're not going to. Olynyk's rebounding is a non-existent thing, and if they are just getting worked on the boards, I think they have to go to Leonard before they go to Olynyk. And clearly, they should get worked on the boards given the ridiculous size of the Lakers.
So Olynyk, not Olynyk. Myers Leonard only got on the court for one postseason game. I thought there was a few of them for some reason, but yeah, it was game 3 against the Bucks. He played 9 minutes and scored 3 fantasy points. I thought there was a couple other games there wasn't. I don't know. I still think it's going to be Olynyk because to me, he's still first. Olynyk's the better NBA player, and then second, matchup aside, Olynyk's been ahead of Myers Leonard in the rotation all postseason. That I still think it's going to be Olynyk before Myers Leonard. I have to think that way just because of how they've run the rotation so far. I get that it's a different matchup, but even so, I think they give Olynyk the first shot, and then if he doesn't work out, then I think they might go to Myers Leonard.
Do you have anything else you want to touch on from the Heat? Like any specific Bam or Butler takes? We have them with pretty similar ownership. Butler significantly more in the captain spot, however, also quite a bit cheaper. Butler more expensive on FanDuel. Bam Adebayo basically twice the ownership. I think all of that largely makes sense, although I do think Bam is going slightly over-owned. Look, these are just the two guys that are going to make the Heat tick here. I don't really have much of a take. They're going to be involved.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is if Bam and or Butler doesn't have a big game, the Heat lose. Right? There's no situation where they play poorly and then it's like, there was a big Duncan Robinson game. He scored 40 points so the Heat stay in the game. Like, I don't think that's a likely outcome. I don't even think Goran Dragic could carry this team by himself. There's going to have to be a big Butler or Bam game. Yeah. And I think it's probably more likely Bam than Butler. Butler's just kind of been solid, but not great in the playoffs. His usage is really weird because he had a big usage game in the last game against the Celtics, but for the most part, he's been like the 18 to 21% usage around that range. There's been, I don't know, like 4 or 5 playoff games where he's really been big, but for the most part, he's been more consistent than high upside guy. So I think that for the captain spot, I prefer Bam to Butler, especially considering the ownership, because we haven't gotten a 50 fantasy point game again from Butler since the first game of the series against the Bucks. Other than that, it's been 38 to 42 DraftKings points pretty much every game.
Yeah, so Butler, twice as much ownership in the captain spot right now, $1,800 or $1,400 cheaper rather. That's about where the sim spit it out. I'm lighter on both of those guys, but the disparity between Butler to Bam is the same. I think the salary difference is really just making up all of the weight there. Is this a Duncan Robinson or Tyler Hero game by any chance? I think that's the final thing we could touch on for the Heat.
Probably not. I mean, Tyler Hero is always going to have that upside, but he's so priced up on DraftKings and FanDuel at this point that it just makes him a poor play to me. You mentioned comparing him to Dragic, and I think that is the comparison because they're about the same price point on both sites. Dragic a little more expensive on DraftKings, Hero a little more expensive on FanDuel. We're just comparing the production of the two, and they played pretty much the same exact amount of minutes per game in the regular season. Dragic averaged a decent amount more fantasy points. I think Dragic is the way better fantasy play of the two. Tyler Hero, maybe you could talk yourself into him having a little bit more upside, but the price just is too high for Hero.
Okay. Perfect opportunity. 220 viewers. Hit that thumbs up. Helps us out a ton. We've got a lot of free content for everybody today, including NFL ownership, free today. You want to get a look of what Sunday is going to look like? Today's the day to do it. Our NBA rankings, free today. 8 MLB games going on. We've got MLB top stacks for free today. And finally, PGA rankings. We'll have Ben Raza and Jason Roslin going tonight for PGA Live Before Lock. Early edition, 6 p.m., I believe. So tune into that one. It is 6 p.m. 9:45, so like 25 minutes immediately after this show, Jason and Adam will do MLB strategy. 11 a.m., Lofty, Matt, and Kyle. We've got NFL strategy. As I mentioned, Jason and Ben at 6. Other Jason and Pete at 7 for MMA Live Before. Actually, MMA strategy. Today is Wednesday, not Saturday. And then finally, Lofty and Adam will be back 8 p.m. Eastern time tonight. NBA Live Before Lock before game 1 of the finals. But that's not all. Promo code Orlando. You can get a $5 Awesemo Plus weekly pass. That's $10 off the original price. You get projections, ownership, every showdown and single game slate. It's only valid through Sunday. So if you want to get this pass, use the promo code Orlando when checking out. That's obviously where they are playing. Get a $5 Awesemo Plus weekly NBA pass. You cannot beat that deal. Sign up now. Let's slide over to the Lakers. I don't get the sense that we really need to talk about LeBron or AD all that much. If you don't know what you're getting out of those two guys at this point in time, I don't really recommend you play any sort of NBA-related fantasy product. Do you have anything that you want to add about LeBron or AD right now?
Yeah, I think LeBron is the much higher upside player of the two. I mean, if we look at the run that LeBron's on the postseason, it's ridiculous. And it's hard to think that he's this old. He has this many miles on his body and continues to do this. You look at his fantasy production throughout the playoffs; it's been ridiculous. I mean, the final closeout game against the Nuggets was terrific. 79 fantasy points, triple double, and he's getting his fantasy points so easily too. There's almost no bad fantasy games from him on his game log. He has a couple of games around 40 fantasy points, but he's more likely to score over 60 fantasy points than he is below it at this point. So I think that of the two, LeBron and AD, if you're only picking one of them, LeBron is the one that I prefer to pay up for.
Okay. Yeah. LeBron, $1,200 more expensive on DK, $1,000 more expensive on FanDuel. That will help level that playing field a little bit. They're essentially equal in everything other than AD more primarily owned in the captain spot due to the additional savings. I think this is the next spot that we have to go, and I think it's the most important piece. What does the center rotation look like for the Los Angeles Lakers? Does JaVale McGee move back to the starting lineup? Does Dwight Howard continue to play large minutes? Does it now become a time where the Lakers are done screwing around and Anthony Davis is just their 5? How does this impact someone like Markieff Morris? Is he now a benefactor of additional minutes if they stop playing traditional centers? What say you, Greg? What are they doing at the 5?
Yeah, so I'll say this. I'm going to, whatever my decision is about the rotation going forward, is going to be very heavily influenced by whatever the starting lineup is when we get that. Sure. I assume it's going to be Dwight Howard for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that they're probably going to want him to match up against Bam. The other thing, too, is he played so well against Jokic in the last series that I think that he's played himself into more minutes. Look at what they did in the closeout game. 35 minutes for Dwight Howard. I don't expect him to play 35 minutes per game for a couple of reasons. Number one, we just haven't seen all year. And then number two, he's probably going to get in foul trouble more often than not if he plays that many minutes. But either way, I look at the 35 minutes for him last game and think that he's by far the best value play in this game. As long as he starts, I don't even care what the ownership is. Dwight Howard is somebody who is going to be in almost, if not all of my lineups, because I just think that he's that good of a value play. And I want to be overweight to the field on him, because if he's going to approach 30 minutes or play over it like he did last game, he's going to succeed almost every time at this price.
Dwight Howard, 5K projected for 5% ownership.
Yeah, that's incorrect. He's going to get a lot more ownership than that.
How many minutes do you expect him to play?
Yeah, so this is where it's really tough. It's a different matchup, but he also played 35 minutes last game, and I don't think the rotation is going to be exactly the same. And the foul trouble is always an issue. If I say he's going to play 35 minutes again, then he's just the best play by such a wide margin and stuff. But I don't think that's likely. I have him for 28 right now. Okay. And I'm not really sure what to make of that. I don't think I'm going to get his minutes right. I think I'm either going to be it's going to be one of two extremes. Either they're going to mix it up a ton and he's going to play less minutes than I expect, or he's going to do something like he did last game, play, the same amount of minutes, but I just can't project him to play 35 again, but I think it's possible.
Yeah. If he plays, 35 minutes, it doesn't appear that the public is even remotely close to projecting him for 35 minutes. That's for sure. I gave him 18, and at 18 minutes, I have him show up in the sim like 2.5 times as often as the current public ownership, about 13% of the time at 5K. I feel pretty comfortable there. I wouldn't want to go too much further. Alex, when I grabbed the data earlier today, by earlier, it's 9:28 a.m. before this show started, Alex has him at 22 minutes right now. That would make him show up in next to everything that I do on DraftKings. So I think that is sort of the correct range, so to speak. Now, if we see, obviously, the moment we know that he is starting or not starting changes the equation for him completely. If we see that Dwight is starting, 5% ownership just isn't going to be what he is. If we see that he is not starting, I don't think that that's terribly incorrect ownership, because at the very least, that they're doing something else, whether that's going back to the traditional JaVale at the beginning of the first and third lineups, which they have been. It wouldn't surprise me if they go back to what they're used to and then make their pivots from that, full stop.
That would surprise me.
Really?
Just because. Okay. So I would be not surprised if they go to Markieff Morris. I would be really surprised if they go to JaVale McGee, just because he plays a lot of the same role as Dwight Howard. Dwight Howard just outplayed him so handily in the playoffs. And even in the regular season, when they were both getting minutes and kind of splitting it, the Dwight Howard minutes were always much better than JaVale McGee minutes. This was a little ridiculous, but somebody voted for him for Sixth Man of the Year award. But either way, he was very effective off the bench, and he was a big reason why the Lakers defense actually was. They had a better defensive rating when AD was off the court, when AD was on the court, and it was because Dwight Howard was so impactful this year. I think that Dwight Howard is such a better option. McGee, I don't understand, what does McGee bring over Dwight Howard that would make them go back to him, other than that this is what they did for most of the season. But if that was the case, why wouldn't they have just started JaVale McGee for the last couple of games of last series when they went to Dwight Howard? I don't think there's anything that McGee provides to them that Dwight Howard doesn't.
I don't think that they're worried about what JaVale provides, so to speak, as it is just sort of they have a routine that was highly successful for the entire season. And at the very least, going back to that routine to start provides you with a baseline of information. You know very much what you're getting out of that starting lineup. If that begins to be a problem, you already know that you are capable of making that change. We have JaVale McGee projected for 18% ownership on DraftKings right now. Granted, he is 1,800. That is not he's not priced at any sort of real price tag. 18% is a lot. 18% is implying that in general, the public is projecting him to play a rotation.
Yeah, if we look at, even when he was starting last series, he actually didn't really do all that much. The last 2 games of the series, he played 5 minutes, scored 1 fantasy point, 2 minutes, scored less than a fantasy point. And then the 3 games he started last series, 10 minutes, 11 minutes, 8 minutes, 1 fantasy point, 11 fantasy points, 7 fantasy points. So even those games, it was Dwight Howard who was the better fantasy producer. I think it's going to be Dwight Howard that starts, but once again, we're going to have this information. It's a 1-game slate. We're going to have the information before lock, and I'll be making a lot of changes based on whatever the Lakers starting lineup is. But my expectation is Dwight Howard starts at center.
Now, this question doesn't have much to do with DFS. This is just asking you seriously. Do you think that Dwight Howard is the best option to start in this game? Or would you want to go a different direction and have AD at the 5?
I think it's Dwight Howard. For most of the season, I've said that I think Anthony Davis should have been the starting center. But part of that also was just because JaVale McGee wasn't really all that impactful. He was just on the court and played minutes. But we saw the minutes with Dwight Howard, and the Lakers played really well last series with Dwight Howard playing alongside Anthony Davis. And we didn't see a ton of that in the regular season. So after seeing how successful they were with Dwight Howard in the starting lineup, and Dwight Howard's defense was ridiculous on Jokic in those final couple of games. He defended him really well. He did a better job defending Jokic than Anthony Davis did, and he caused all kinds of foul issues for Jokic. Also, just his overall petulance. I don't even know how to describe some of the but he frustrated Jokic with some of the nonsense he was doing, pulling on his jersey and flailing his arms all around. But it worked on Jokic. I think he's earned himself more playing time, and I would be most interested to see Dwight Howard at center.
I actually agree with you. I don't mean that because I think that your opinions are normally awful, and I can't believe that I'm getting there. I really like this ultra big team that they can run out there. I never thought that I would, given the way that this league works now. But they can afford to have Dwight be really, really aggressive in the pick and roll, because other teams in the NBA don't have Anthony Davis and LeBron James as backline defenders as rim protection if your center gets beat. They have the ability to close down on anything that happens, no matter how bad Dwight's pick and roll deep. Like they might get caught in a couple additional rotations. That's when it'll get scary, when that ball is getting swung back out to a Duncan Robinson or a Tyler Hero. But in terms of just the penetration alone, like if Dragic wins a pick and roll and gets by Dwight, he has to wait for LeBron and AD coming from most likely opposite angles to fully erase him. That's terrifying. Or the pick and roll defense works well, Dwight gets to drop, and everything looks great. So I actually do like the idea of Dwight starting. I just have no idea how many minutes this dude plays. And right now, public, 22% ownership going to Markieff Morris. Do you think that Markieff Morris is the better option than Kuzma for this series?
I actually don't, because if we look at what Markieff Morris minutes were for last series, and I have to assume that there's some sort of continuation from what happened last series, and then obviously we adjust a little bit after game 1, but Markieff Morris didn't play very much against Denver, and even when he did play, he didn't really produce at all. Last 4 games, 2 fantasy points, 5, 10, 8, and that was playing about a dozen minutes per game. The other issue I have with Markieff Morris is just there's other value options that I like here. Him at $2,600. I'd rather pay up for Alex Caruso, $400 more. Certainly would rather certainly would rather get to Dwight. I'm not really strongly considering Markieff Morris. I think there is an outside chance that he starts, which would obviously change things greatly. But for now, I think he's just going to continue to play in like that 12 to 15 minute range, and he's not a good enough permanent fantasy producer to really be a great play in those minutes.
I'm with you there. I do prefer Caruso as well. If we're talking about in a vacuum, Caruso currently projected for basically twice as much ownership as Morris. So it does start to get a little bit sneakier then. KCP is kind of just sort of overpriced. You know what you're going to get out of him. Very little offense, a couple open threes. I assume he's just going to be guarding Jimmy Butler a lot. Or potentially chasing around Tyler Hero / Duncan Robinson. I think that's probably more of a Danny Green situation. What do we do with Rondo? I don't know really what to make of his minutes any longer. He could play 20 or 30, and I'd be like, yep, got it.
Yeah, I mean, what really throws me off is that he played 13 minutes last game, which makes him really risky. At the same time, too, we have to see what his ownership is as we get closer to lock. I think that he's potentially a very, very good GPP play because the upside is there. And both of us are not Rondo fans, but for a while, he was probably the Lakers' 3rd best player in the playoffs. He played very, very well earlier in the playoffs. And the other thing that's weird about Rondo is the way teams defend him, where Rondo's not a good shooter, but he's a pretty decent shooter when there's nobody guarding him. And people have been defending him in the playoffs like he's Ben Simmons, where they're like, oh, we're going to give Rondo all the space in the world. He's going to make those shots.
He's not a bad shooter.
No, especially, I mean, he's not somebody who's going to catch and shoot and knock down defended shots. But the reason his numbers look okay is that there's this reputation that he's such a bad shooter that people just leave him wide open. And that's just not the case. It's very weird. I don't know why people haven't made that adjustment, but
he used to be a bad shooter.
He used to be a bad shooter. And then you know what happened is he figured out how to shoot because people never guarded him and just left him open, and nobody's ever adjusted. So
2015-16, 36%. 2016-17, 37.5%. A little blip when he went to New Orleans. 36% last year. Hasn't been great this year, but he also had sort of like a lost season. But 33% is still not like Russell Westbrook shoots like 8 threes a game at 29%, generally up until January of this year. So
the Rockets guarded him like he was Lou Dort. I mean, he touched the ball. They gave him the Lou Dort treatment where Rondo got the ball. They all ran away from him. They're like, hey, Rondo, shoot. And he obliged and made a bunch of them. And just,
do you know what he's shooting in the playoffs? And he hasn't shot he's only shot 29 threes in the playoffs.
I'm just guessing. I'm just going off memory. Probably around 40% though.
45.
Yeah,
because he's 13 of 29 in the playoffs from three this year. And he was 8 of 19 last year. So that's 21 of 48.
I mean, he's a high IQ player. And if teams are going to leave him open, he's going to take those shots. And that's what happened last year. Not last series, this series against the Rockets. What's tough though is, like I said, only 13 minutes last game. The thing is that if he plays, 22, 25 minutes, he's such a good permanent fantasy producer that he could have a big fantasy game in those kind of minutes. He scored over a fantasy point per minute this season, and that's generally what we get from him is around a fantasy point per minute for his career. So there's definitely an avenue there for a big fantasy game. The other thing too is that we don't know. The Lakers could give him 27 minutes, 28 minutes again, like we saw before. And if that's the case, then he probably crushes. So I'm interested to see where his ownership shakes out, because if he ends up being popular, I don't really want all that much to do with him. If he's not popular, then I think he's one of the stronger plays on the slate.
Do you prefer Rondo or Dwight? $400 separating the two on DraftKings.
Yeah, right now, Dwight, especially because Dwight isn't projected for all that much ownership. But yeah, we have to see what that looks like come closer to lock. If Dwight comes off the bench, then I'm going to prefer Rondo.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with you there. What else do we need to touch? Is there anything else you want to touch on from the Lakers that you think we need to get in right now? We got about 5 minutes left before we got to cede control over to the MLB guys.
You talked about KCP there for a second. You know what's kind of funny about KCP is he scores like 18, 19, 20 fantasy points almost every single game. So if you're filling out the final spot on your lineup, I don't mind rostering KCP. Not a lot of upside there, but I think he's viable. I definitely prefer him to Danny Green, who's $400 cheaper, because Danny Green is doing almost nothing in the playoffs. So that's the one thing I'll say over KCP is if you're looking for a cheapish wing on the Lakers, KCP is a better option than Danny Green.
Antoine Murphy says he thinks that Braun will be guarding Jimmy most cases. I expect him to be on someone like Jay Crowder more often than not.
I think that where he guards
early,
Jimmy,
at least.
Yeah, I was going to say fourth quarter he guards Butler.
Yep, I agree. I think more often than not you put him on Jay Crowder and he is just the ultimate help defender, and you don't have to worry about him chasing anybody around for most of the game. I think you'd rather have LeBron playing free safety and they have plenty of guys that can guard Jimmy Butler. And I'm like, you know what I'm saying? Obviously LeBron is going to do a better job guarding Jimmy Butler than those guys are, but at the same time, then you're sort of just wasting Danny Green standing in the corner next to Jay Crowder, or wasting KCP standing next to insert other bad guy here. Yeah, I think you can serve LeBron as much as possible defensively with a matchup on Crowder for as much as he can.
Yeah, I just like the phrase "wasting Danny Green" as if there's some high purpose for Danny Green.
Don't do this to me. I'm a huge Danny Green guy.
I think he was very good at one point in time.
I think Danny Green is one of the best players ever in the NBA at his role.
I think that was very true at one point in time, and I think he's no longer that player. But when he was on the Spurs, even last year for the Raptors, that was definitely true.
Yeah. I don't think that he is the difference maker that he once was, but like he he is just as important to a championship team as like your number 2 banana, because he was a guy that could guard the other team's best defensive player on the wing and shoot 40% from 3. And that is like so wildly valuable. I'm such a Danny Green guy, which it's never fun.
You know what else is funny about that is he was the same way for, if anybody plays yearly fantasy leagues, for Roto leagues, there was a point in time where Danny Green was like a top 30 player just because he was really good percentages, good defensive stats, and didn't turn the ball over. So for Roto leagues, he was a guy who was really valuable, but could be had in like the 10th round of drafts and then return like 4th round total value. So kind of the same fantasy player that he was in real life in that sense.
And I am a huge, or at least was a huge Duke fan. So I naturally hated Danny Green pretty aggressively for an extended amount of time. So you have to be pretty good for me to get rid of my former biases, and hating everyone that went to North Carolina was definitely one of them for the better part of my life until DFS ruined sports. In a different way. It didn't like totally ruin it.
Yeah.
But, like I don't have fandom anymore.
Yeah, neither do I. I mean, my fandom is just my fantasy team, and it's generally changing from game to game. But there's also this about fantasy. I don't think football is watchable if it's not for gambling and fantasy aspects at this point in time. I could watch basketball all day. I could even watch baseball. I love to watch MMA. There's certain sports, football being one of them, that if I don't have fantasy implications, I do not care about football at all.
If it wasn't for the Red Zone channel, I would never watch football. I think it's a terrible television product.
It's definitely not. It's you know what's funny is there's so many stoppages in football. All the reason that people say they hate baseball, those things are amplified in football, and people say that the reasons they like football are because of, hey, there's constant action, which there isn't in baseball. It's like, no, there's a play every 90 seconds in football.
It's basically just a show about commercials that has sports in between.
There's a lot of commercials.
It's awful. I hate it. Anyway,
it's so good for fantasy, though. It's so
yeah,
good.
I love it. I hate that too, but that's neither here nor there. But I hate that for different reasons.
It's also because there's not very many fantasy sports that so much get hinge on any individual play, right? There aren't really other sports where it's like, oh, there's an 18-point fantasy play in football. There's a long touchdown. I mean, there's home runs in baseball, except it doesn't have quite as much sway as the long touchdowns in football.
Yeah, this isn't like Rock and Jock. LeBron can't hit a 50-point basket or call in like the money ball or whatever the hell they had in the Rock and Jock softball games, or the 8 ball. It was worth 8 runs.
Gets a rebound at his own free throw line and chucks it the full length of the court and makes it right before the end of the third quarter. So, and it's like, oh my God, my fantasy team has scored 50 points because I stacked LeBron with whoever. So
not such nonsense. Any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Let's go final predictions. I still think the Lakers win this series pretty comfortably. I wouldn't be totally shocked if the Heat end up winning. But I think that the Lakers are the much better team. I think we're going to look back on this ultimately and say that the Eastern Conference was very weak this season.
Lakers in 5. Look, this is LeBron in the finals against a team that, by all accounts, he's better than. It's not like he was going to a bunch of finals and gacking them away. He ran into arguably the greatest team ever in the Warriors, still picked one of them off there. I'm not betting against LeBron here. Lakers in 5. I really like what the Heat are doing. It's been really fun to watch. They need another guy. So I don't want to say go Lakers because like that's not exciting either, but go LeBron because I just want him to win so that I can continue my he is the greatest stance.
Yeah, that's fair. And then I certainly look forward to the discourse on Twitter for the next 8 months or however long it is until the next NBA season starts.
Nothing better than Twitter. That's for sure. Guys, hit the like button on your way out the door. Thank you for joining us. MLB show coming up right now. We out of here.